And my biggest concern with that is we know how long litigation takes. And if we follow this route, we might end up actually only getting a judgment from either one of the courts, and then it's going to be the next year in any case.
Former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke has recommended to the Electoral Commission that it postpone South Africa's local government elections to early next year. What are the legal implications of this decision? Well, joining me to discuss is Daniël Eloff. He's an attorney with Spies attorneys. Daniel, welcome back to the CRA channel. Could you tell our viewers what are some of the legal implications of this recommendation?
Sure. Thank you, David, and thank you for having me back. It's always nice to chat to you and all your listeners and viewers. So the background of this decision by the IEC to postpone the election has actually been coming for quite a couple of months. Ever since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been this question mark hanging over whether or not we will be able to have free, safe, and fair elections in 2021. Obviously, the elections we're referring to is the local government elections that were due to be held in August of this year, were then later postponed to October. And then the IEC instructed the former Deputy Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Justice Moseneke, to investigate and inquire into whether or not South Africa is able to host free, fair, and safe elections during this time. And after consultation with various interested parties and a bunch of people and organizations making representations, the former Justice Moseneke's team came to the conclusion that South Africa and the IEC won't be able to host safe elections during October of this year, and it then made the recommendation to postpone the elections to the second month of 2022. So it's quite important perhaps just to briefly mention that the terms of reference provided to the team and to the inquiry simply asked the question, will South Africa be able to host safe elections this year? The question wasn't whether or not South Africa or the country in its constitutional framework is able to do this, whether or not it's constitutionally valid to actually postpone the elections beyond this year.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
Well, that raises the question, Daniel, in terms of the constitutionality of this decision, putting aside the health and safety concerns. Is it actually possible to do this? Because the Constitution prescribes term limits. If you exceed those terms, then you're in breach of the Constitution. So surely that is a hard stop to that discussion.
Yes, definitely. So it's a very interesting question because so obviously on the one hand you have the right to vote, but then there's the argument to be made, well, we're not taking away people's right to vote and participate in the local government elections. We're merely postponing it, a couple of months later. But that's only the first part of the question. The second part refers to the terms, like you mentioned, of municipal councils. And section 159(2) of the Constitution says that an election must be held 90 days from the date that that council's term was due to expire. So we have both these constitutional principles, the one, your right to vote, and the other being prescribing a very fixed date on when local government elections need to take place, and that's 90 days after their term comes to an end. So the initial decision to postpone the election to October would have fallen within that 90-day time frame, but now pushing it out to February of 2022 it's now beyond those 90 days, and now we're sitting with this constitutional anomaly of whether or not it is possible. And the problem with this entire debate is it's going to boil down to I'm saying but every single person, and in the end, the court that's going to have to deal with these questions, how they view the Constitution. Is it something that's flexible? Is it something that can be changed and adapted to suit whatever needs to be suited? because what's going to, in the end of the day, the court's going to say, well, is that 90-day prescription in section 159 a fixed time? Is it something that we have to adhere to, or can we just willy-nilly change it? And this obviously, begs a lot of other important questions regarding our constitution, regarding how supreme it really is, if we're able to just by a decision and through a report determine that we'll just circumvent it, and due to whatever circumstances we believe are important, we can just bend it and change it as we please.
Yeah, I think that has some quite important implications for the rule of law in South Africa. You can't just abrogate
Indeed.
those rules. So Daniel, what do you think are some of the risks emerging from this? Why should people be concerned about the postponement to the election?
So obviously the most important thing is South Africa fought really hard for the right to vote. Our democracy isn't something that came cheaply. And so it's so crucially important to protect the very democracy and the elections that we fought for many years for all South Africans to enjoy. The second problem is it like I mentioned earlier, it waters down the supremacy of the Constitution. If the Constitution says one thing, now suddenly the IEC is able to bend it, and government's able to bend it as they want to. And then the third problem is, if the South African government is able to postpone an election for a pandemic of this nature, then government will be able to postpone elections for a myriad of other reasons that they might say is justifiable. If we say that we are going to postpone the election for COVID-19, it's easy to argue that South Africa should postpone the election for prevailing economic circumstances, or perhaps for another virus or another threat to South Africans. The problem is it takes away from I would say the strength of the Constitution, the predictability of having elections, and it really puts us on a treacherous path and potentially on a slippery slope.
Yes, and of course, in the background to this discussion is the proposed amendments to the Constitution, and specifically Section 25. There seems politically to be a lot of antipathy building towards our constitutional order and the safeguards that the Constitution puts in place. So Daniel, how do you see this process playing out over the short to medium term?
So what would first need to happen is the IEC will have to approach either the Electoral Court or arguably the Constitutional Court to certify a postponement. So that will happen likely within the next couple of months. This court case won't be the sort of run-of-the-mill application that the IEC usually have. It frequently happens that the IEC have to approach the Electoral Court to postpone elections. Often by-elections need to be postponed for whatever reasons. We saw it happening at the beginning of the year, where around a dozen by-elections were postponed. And it's usually quite easy and straightforward. The IEC approach the court, they say why it needs to be postponed, and the courts are generally inclined to grant the IEC their postponement of the election. But what will likely happen in this instance is the IEC will approach the Electoral Court or the Constitutional Court, and we'll see a bunch of organizations jumping in and litigating with or against the IEC on why it should or should not postpone the elections. And my biggest concern with that is we know how long litigation takes. And if we follow this route, we might end up actually only getting a judgment from either one of the courts, and then it's going to be the next year in any case. So what really needs to happen, and this is a point I try to make as frequently as possible, despite it sort of being against my interest as an attorney, but our courts of law are just another forum where you're able to fight the battle of ideas. It's not the sort of last resort that I think many people think it is. It's just another opportunity to advocate for policy, to advocate for change, and to advocate for actual progress. And that's how we need to view it in this instance as well. If we want to ensure that South Africa actually has an election in 2021, and that we don't water down our constitution, and that people keep their right to vote, then it's going to require a lot more than this just participation in the court process. It's going to people are going to have to make their voices heard. We're going to have to rally the South African people to say, well, no, we don't agree with this. We weren't actually properly consulted in this process, because that's another question mark that hangs over the report by Justice Moseneke, is although various organizations were asked to make representations on whether or not the election should be postponed, the general South African population weren't asked that question. There wasn't a public participation process or facilities where people could say, yes, I want it postponed or not. And at the very least, we need to get that data so that we can support and underpin our decisions in the future. So that's sort of what I expect will happen within the next couple of months. And there might likely be a constitutional challenge that seeks to review the decision to postpone the elections, not because we're trying to have the elections happen in this year, but because it will be crucially important to ensure that we get clarity on the constitutional question of whether or not government is able to postpone an election past 90 days as required by Section 159 of the Constitution. And although the question therefore won't have an active fact sheet, if you can call it that, or some incident that it's talking about, but it will happen in the abstract. It will sort of be academic, but it will be crucially important to answer that question going forward, and for future instances where the government might potentially want to postpone any one of the two types of elections that we have in South Africa.
Daniël Eloff, thank you very much for joining us on the CRA channel. It's always good to have you here, and we'll be watching this issue very closely indeed. To you, our viewers, let me know what you think of my new office setup and my sound. I'm still in the process of upgrading this room, but I look forward to seeing your feedback in the comments. That's it from me, David Ansara. Until next time, take care.